Thank you, Al and Louisa, for asking me to come back. Do I have slides here? Yes, here we go. So I'm going to start with a bit of a sort of caveat. I suspect nobody here knows who Gary Boom is. He was my 11th grade American literature teacher. But what he said is that an observation tends to reveal more about the observer than the observed. And since I'm the observer in this case, you can take everything I say with generous amounts of salt. What I wanted to look at was, and I do not mean to submit that consolidation is by any means a panacea, but really I actually did some original research for this. Mostly I just rehash old slides when Al asked me to talk. This time I did some original research and I actually looked at least to the extent available, real market data. This is all presented in terms of units, not dollars. And I specifically started off by looking at the U.S. Offshore oil and gas sector and compared that to the U.S. aeromedical sector. And if you look at these two pie charts, they actually look strikingly similar, but that's deceptive in my opinion because truly I think the offshore oil and gas market is a global market, whereas the aeromedical market is in fact much more sort of domestic, and there are reasons we can talk about why it doesn't extrapolate in the same way. So, and I did pro forma in looking at the fleet figures I had, Bristow and Era. So in continuing, I said, okay, let's talk about what is sort of the genesis of offshore oil and gas. Arguably, the first true non-military or commercial civil mission that was revenue generating. Many companies could claim their heritage back to the 1950s. Number of post-Korea vets came back to the States, started companies, and you can see on, I guess, the left-hand side of the slide some of the events preceding the past 10 years, and then basically the graph shows you kind of the tracking of the price of oil relative to some key events that happened during that time frame. And then the box in the upper right shows you well-known information with regard to key events within the past basically 12 months. What I was shocked to discover, if I can get the slide to move, I tended to think of these as adhering to what I would describe as a Pareto distribution, meaning that there's effectively an end-state oligopoly that we're driving towards. And again, the bias that I'm bringing to the research is that the more capital-intensive an industry is, the more likely it is to potentially even have a single provider of service. Arguably, electric utilities and the transmission and distribution fits that mold. They're mostly monopolies, and they're meant to be that way, and then there are public utility commissions or some other sort of independent body that governs, the degree to which they can raise rates and so forth. So anyway, I was a little nervous when I saw Chris's presentation. I think I have the figure for the combined fleet, which is the tall dark line on the left, in the 275 range or so. Chris's number was 303. He relieved me a little bit by telling me that included some fixed wing assets, so maybe I'm off by 10. But I was somewhat struck to see how many unique names there are in offshore oil and gas, and to see that the median fleet size is 3. And the mode, which is just the most frequent instance of fleet size, is 1. If you compare that market share analysis to The flight operations segment, this is a segment that in the U.S. basically came into existence in a kind of mid to late 70s and early 80s post-Vietnam era, where medevac was very effectively done using helicopters in theater. You can see that over almost the past 20 years, the industry has consolidated much more significantly. There are many fewer names, granted in a smaller market, because we're just talking about a regional market. The median is still only 2, but the key is that the top 2 operators represent 60% of the total market. The top 4 represent 80% of the total market. And really the reason the median and mode, or the mean even for that matter, are as low as they are is because the remaining 20%, which is about 235 helicopters, are spread across 72 operators with an mean average fleet of 3. And then I just wanted to pick another market, and since we're on this side of the pond, I decided I would look at the utility market. To be clear, I classified within utility firefighting and agricultural applications as well. Often similar types of aircraft are able to address all 3 missions. And the total aircraft in this fleet, this is Europe only, and I should also qualify, Europe only, Western-built turbine engine helicopters. So I'm not including anything that's a piston engine helicopter. I'm not including any Russian helicopters, and I'm only including commercial civil fleet operators. So if there was a government operator of some sort that's doing firefighting or something like that, I excluded those assets. What I'm trying to do is identify who's potentially transactable in this data set. And in this case, to get to the top quartile, you needed 10 operators. It didn't even make sense, really. I mean, if you look, the mean is 2, the median is 1, and the mode is 1. And these all have a similar shape, but it isn't until you actually go to the next slide, which now puts them all on the same scale, that you can see how, and I don't know how easy it is for you guys to see this, but the big dark blue bars are the air medical market. The red bars that are overlaid on that are offshore oil and gas. So you can see the region that's sort of to the right of the 4th big blue bar arguably represents sort of territory that ought to be transacted, and that could be consolidated into the left-hand players on the offshore oil and gas market, which would, in theory, conform to a more similar shape of the curve for U.S. air medical. But what's even more striking is the European utility market with, as I sliced it, less than 1,000 helicopters. But it's about, if you include all of the operators, including the ones I told you I excluded, because the market's still getting served, it's about 30% of the global market, which is a meaningful sort of European representation in the global market. So what are the implications of what I presented here? I do think there's opportunity. If you look at all 3 of these verticals, offshore, EMS, and utility, you're talking globally about in excess of 8,000 units. Just between EMS and utility, so carving out the offshore oil and gas, that's 6,500 helicopters. Granted, not the same value per unit as most of what's deployed in oil and gas, but still a sizable market to be addressed. And somewhat to my surprise, I would have to say after doing the research, the most consolidated end-use vertical market for helicopters is in fact U.S. air medical, not, as I just sort of tended to walk around thinking to be the case, offshore oil and gas, notwithstanding the fact that oil and gas basically became a commercial product a generation ahead of EMS. And then, at least if Europe is indicative of the global market conditions within utility, it's the least consolidated vertical. It's a sticky flipper here. What do I need to do? There we go. So here are my observations. While most mature, actually the global offshore oil and gas fleet does have room for consolidation. The second and third quartiles that I presented to you represent 27 operators with 435 aircraft, an average fleet of 16. And I get that not all of these are necessarily acquirable, and not all of them are necessarily desirable, and there are AOC considerations. But to the extent that somebody is already operating in one of those markets, it would appear that there are potential benefits from bringing consolidation into those particular pockets regionally. The other thing that struck me from this, in general, if you look at the global market, the U.S. has sort of tended to hover globally at around 30% of the global market, and rest of world markets typically have represented about 70%. This is sort of for the industry writ large. But actually, in doing the research, what I found is that including U.S. Army assets and other aeromatically configured helicopters in the U.S. Represents in units 55% of the global EMS fleet. And even if you carve out the sort of government and military assets and just look at civil helicopters operated by commercial operators, you're still at 49%. If the 30% equilibrium is really where kind of, or put differently, if rest of world demand at 70% is sort of an end state that it makes sense to drive towards, that would suggest that EMS in the rest of the world should grow by about 1,500 aircraft. What I haven't told you is that of the nearly 1,200, 1,170 in the data set, EMS helicopters in the U.S., that market has probably gotten overbuilt, I would submit, by at least 200 helicopters, maybe as many as 300, and probably needs to shrink to, somewhere closer to 900. But that is potentially what could be the source of supply for some of the redeployment at more affordable cost than factory new into rest of world EMS markets. The big questions with aeromedical transportation, which we're grappling with in the U.S. as well, relate to the revenue model, and then, of course, as it relates to developing markets, the timing with which this could come on stream. The ultimate conclusion, this industry remains highly fragmented. That's all I have. Happy to take any questions if there are any.
Do we have any questions?